All right, so good afternoon. I'm Brandon Turner. I'll be talking about methods for linking measures of neurophysiology to theories of cognition. So the theme of the symposium is that the brain produces the mind by modeling. So this sort of statement to me would infer a graph that might look something like this, where the parameters omega are controlling the model the brain is using. And so although we can construct these models and make them generate predictions about data that we might observe from an experiment, another approach that Jacques and Nico and others have mentioned is that you could turn this into a statistical problem. And so by that definition, we could instead solve the inverse problem and identify which model the brain is actually trying to use. And if we tried to figure out what the mind is doing from inferring it directly from data, let's say from an EEG or fMRI experiment, it might give us the ability to characterize patterns of the brain's activity in terms of mechanisms that we already know about, because we did, after all, put them forward in part of the model definition. Now, if we knew what the mechanisms were and what their values were for a given individual, let's say by estimating them from data, then we could go one step further and use those mechanisms to generate predictions about behavioral data. Now, under this type of regime, the solution to how the brain produces the mind and how the mind ultimately produces behavior is tantalizingly close. So if we believe that the neural and the behavioral data are truly manifestations of the same underlying construct, that is the mind, then we only have to characterize their joint distribution at some level of abstraction. And so the emphasis on abstraction, at least for me, is important here because the mind, the mental operations, are not directly observable. And so one approach is to rely on latent variables, which naturally capture unobservable constructs. And it turns out many people are already working on this type of linking function or linking hypothesis. We recently developed this taxonomy for just characterizing the researcher's intent. And it turns out if you characterize or lump people into what they're trying to do with this linking strategy, a nice sort of separation ensues. And so one approach is to use the neural data to constrain a behavioral model. Another is to use the behavioral model to try and predict neural data to figure out where those mechanisms are executed in the brain. And another is to consider both aspects of the data as being equally important and simultaneously model all of them. And so all of these approaches, they have unique advantages, but I've spent most of my time kind of working in the simultaneous modeling area, so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that today. So the approach we developed is referred to as just joint modeling, where the joint here just refers to the joint distribution of neural and behavioral data. Now, to build a joint model, you just start by simply identifying candidate brain regions, such as the striatum, which I'm showing here. Now, ideally, the brain regions of interest will have some type of associated time series. This is, after all, their main advantage over things like just behavioral measures alone. And this time series should be linked somehow to the stimulus onset, okay? So the experimental design, in other words, the world that we experience. And we're going to characterize that link, how the stimulus creates changes in the brain with a set of parameters, delta. In parallel, we developed some kind of computational model that's appropriate for the cognitive task at hand. And the best form of linking will come about when a model that also makes an explicit prediction for the time series information, just so it parallels the neural data. And again, we're going to have a set of parameters that allows some modulation of these predictions, just so we can fit behavioral data really well. And we're going to call those parameters theta. Finally, we have to specify how the parameters delta and theta coexist. And this can be something rather simple, such as general linear model. It can be something more complex, such as multivariate normal distribution. In the end, the final specification of how changes in delta would induce changes in theta is what creates a probabilistic version of the linking function. And so the strategy here is to simply specify that a link may exist, and our goal here is just to infer the strength of that link directly from data. Now, if we were able to fit a full model like this to data, it'd give us a few advantages, perhaps the strongest of which is the induced reciprocity that's inherited from the hierarchical structure of the model. And so specifically in this framework, the pattern of neural data, here shown at the top, could actually be used indirectly to influence cognitive model parameters theta at the bottom. And the vice versa is also true. So if I have patterns in the cognitive model that's being predicted, it can actually help me drive the analysis of the neural data. And so by using the theoretical commitments that the cognitive model instantiates, the argument is that we're sort of better postured to interpret highly complex multivariate patterns in brain data through the lens of a cognitive model. So today I'll summarize 3 lines of research that use joint modeling just as kind of like a highlight reel. One domain is in perceptual choice, another is in subjective valuation, and another one's a new approach to driving an adaptive stimulus protocol within real-time fMRI experiments. So for this story, we start with perhaps the most actively studied model in the field of mathematical psychology. That's the drift diffusion model. The model describes the joint distribution of choice and response time through a set of parameters corresponding to things like the rate of evidence accumulation, so it's the mean trajectory, these little squiggly lines you see here, the starting point or bias, which would be just where these lines began their initial trajectory, and the threshold, which is the total amount of information you would be needing in order to make a choice. Now, like most decision models, the DDM comes with an explicit assumption of stationarity or independent identically distributed data. And so this means the distribution of all behavioral measures is exactly the same for every trial. It doesn't matter if observers have this, some momentary fluctuation of attention or some frustration with the task. The predictions for the observer's choice are the same at every moment in time. Now, as you can imagine, this particular assumption is not really well supported by experimental data. So here's one example from a nice article just showing interesting patterns within RT data, the time series. And so the point is that there are clear fluctuations in the RT data that this sort of off-the-shelf DDM just wouldn't naturally predict. And so it begs the question, how might these fluctuations be better explained? So another line of research, which is tied to the same problem, addresses whether or not behavioral measures can be meaningfully predicted by neural signals. So one key observation is there's a systematic relationship of activation in the so-called default mode network, and it relates to accuracy as well as RTs. And so as one example, Icelli et al., they present an analysis targeting the default mode network's activity, leading up to an error trial. And so what they did was just determine when errors occurred in their data, and then they sorted trials on the basis of how far in the future that error occurred. They then examined bold responses as a function of this so-called error lag and plotted the results, which are shown here on the right. So as you can see, there's one network in the brain that clearly is deactivating as you're approaching an error, and another that's increasing its activity when you're approaching that error. And so there's something obvious that the brain is doing that can maybe provide a sort of natural covariate for decision-making models. And so the obvious question to ask is, can we somehow use the brain's trial-by-trial activity to predict someone's upcoming behavior? So to address this question, we developed a joint model to link neural data directly to the parameters of the DDM. We start with just the DDM's representation, which is shown here. In a Bayesian framework, you can model these parameters of the DDM fit to choice RT data on each individual trial. So you can say that there's a set of parameters that are going to fluctuate from one trial to the next, and you're going to use them to predict someone's behavior. Now, for the neural data, we also identified a large set of ROIs. We extracted their time series and modeled the activity in each ROI as a function of the presented stimulus. So this is our set of delta parameters. The last step was just to assume that there's some linking function to control how fluctuations in, let's say, delta control fluctuations in theta. We refer to this model as the neural drift diffusion model, as it simply extends the basic architecture of the DDM to include neural covariation. Now, for the experiment, it's just a simple random dot motion task. You present the stimulus, and someone's just going to give you a free response. So when they're ready to make a choice, they tell you to which direction most of the dots are moving. And to be clear here, we're collecting an 8-second pre-stimulus scan. We're trying to use the information in the pre-stimulus scan to predict the choice, because fMRI is a bit slow, and so we can't actually model these dynamics. So we're just trying to say, if someone is kind of off task, can we capture that here and use it to predict the behavioral response? Now, once we fit the model to data, there are a host of different aspects that we can examine. And this is just sort of a high level kind of showing. I'm just showing you aspects of the analysis that I think are particularly relevant. So for example, we can generate what's called a posterior predictive distribution. And this is just a type of generalization that comes forward from the model and tells us what we should expect to see if we were to collect more data. So this is the PPD of two key parameters in the model, drift rate and bias. Now what's really interesting here is that we can carve up this distribution and define types of processes we want to know more about, or rather, what patterns of the brain should we expect given these locations in the parameter space. Okay, so I define these two regions, one that corresponds to fast, accurate processes in the green, and another that's just slow, error-prone processes in the red. Now here's an example where the top row corresponds to the red area, the bottom row corresponds to the green area, and each dot here is representing an ROI, and the degree of activation is shown with that legend on the far right-hand side. So while I don't have time to get into this, the basic idea is that you can use mechanistic comparisons here, defined in the parameter space, something you know something about because you developed the model, and it allows you to inspect patterns of brain data through the lens of this cognitive model. Now, mechanistic interpretations are nice, but it would also be good to know that the neural data are also providing something useful in terms of predicting behavior. So here's an analysis I did that cross-validated the model's predictions. So I refit the data. I separated the data into a training set and a test set. I fit the model to the training set, and I'm generating predictions for the test set. And I did this for two models. So I did this for the NDDM, which has the covariates, and one that's just this sort of off-the-shelf DDM. The NDDM is shown in green, regular DDM is in red. And what we can see here, these are predictions for this test trial, just one that I picked, test trial 82. And these are the distributions that the model are predicting. So as you can see, there's some difference in, say, the drift rate, but there's absolutely nothing going on in the bias. So whatever's going on in the brain, it's leading us to believe this, because the NDDM has that extra bit of information that the regular DDM doesn't have. Now, to validate whether or not these are accurate predictions, we have to kind of look in data space. So we can propagate this information down to data space, and we get predictions for RT distributions shown here. So correct distributions are shown on the left, incorrect are shown on the right. The true data is this, this dashed black line here. So it just happened to be a correct response in this trial, and it was about 500 milliseconds. Now, to evaluate whether or not the neural data are providing a useful signature to outpredict, we have to kind of zoom in here. And my clicker stopped. Okay, so we have to zoom in here. And we just compare the relative heights of these two curves. As you can see, for the NDDM on this particular trial, it is providing more density at that location, which is the probability. So it's trying to outpredict the DDM at that location. Now, this is just one trial. But you can imagine doing this for all of the trials and then ranking them in terms of their preference for NDDM. This is just one fold of the analysis. I've done this several different times, and the range is somewhere between 70 and 91% in favor of the NDDM in this task. Now, going back to the problem of stationarity, we can also examine whether fluctuations in the RT data are predicted by NDDM. So here's a plot of the RT data, sort of concatenated here, and as you can see, there's a potentially interesting fluctuations in the RT data. Now, the off-the-shelf DDM, when you fit these data, regardless of how well the fits and the summary statistics of that model fit to choice RT collapsed across time, you can see that the out-of-sample predictions are flat, right? They're not capturing that nice undulation that seems to be there. But when you fit the NDDM and you generate predictions, you get something much more noisy, but also a time series that correlates pretty well with the true data. So to be fair, NDDM has access to information that the DDM doesn't. But this is precisely why the focus on a joint characterization of both neural and behavioral data is a potentially exciting way to enhance our understanding of cognition through these models. Now, going back to the structure of the model, recall that I generically defined this linking function with a set of parameters omega. In the previous example, omega was actually a deterministic node in the graph, which was comprised of this multivariate mean vector and a variance-covariance matrix. And before, I was looking at all pairwise combinations within sigma, and just as a really generic way of building in co-activation in the brain. But I can tell you that this is computationally very costly, sometimes taking several days to fit the model. So at the time, I already knew this would be prohibitive in terms of wider adoption. So if I wanted to analyze voxel level data rather than ROIs, that something better had to be done. And so we have looked into that. Oh, my clicker stopped. Okay, so we have looked into that. There's no reason to sort of throw out the baby with the bathwater, as I say. So you can still make use of the nice statistical characterization, just place stronger constraints on things like the variance-covariance matrix. So if you use some sort of factor analytic structure, this greatly reduces the number of parameters needed to estimate when fitting the model to data. So you can build in a lot more neural features, and if you're interested for more scalable solutions to this linking problem with factor analytic strategies, well, this is one thing you can check out. So let's move on to a domain that involves cognitive control, but for hedonic stimuli. And so in this context, the type of control that's being implemented is referred to as self-control. So there are many ways of studying self-control, but today I'll just focus on the intertemporal choice task. So in this task, we ask observers, would you rather have $10 now or R dollars in T days? And as experimenters, our goal is to systematically change R and T to affect the probability of choosing this later alternative. So throughout the talk, I'll refer to the first option as shorter sooner, and the second as larger later. Now, when considering the kinds of R's and T's we can choose from, we can look to this joint R and T space. So the x-axis is pretty simple, right? I mean, who doesn't want more money, right? So that one seems pretty obvious. But on the y-axis, not to be too morbid or anything, but our biology sort of dictates how we interact with time. And so suppose for the entirety of this space, we could define some sort of attractiveness, okay? And so for any combination of R and T, we can evaluate how attractive that option would be. Now, when we present these two alternatives, we could have access to the attractiveness of these options, and let's suppose for some observer, they happen to be indifferent across these two, so they're equally attractive. That's what the green is referring to. Now, as a malevolent experimenter, I can, of course, change one or more features of the offer by decreasing the associated reward. And by the logic of who doesn't want more money, it then follows that the distorted option should be less attractive relative to its former self. Now, of course, we can't actually evaluate the accuracy of a subject's choice, but because there are no wrong answers here, it's purely just a subjective decision. But we can evaluate the degree to which a person is inconsistent, and we can refer to these inconsistencies with particular definitions. And so, for example, we could, in this context, we could define self-control as the inconsistent tendency to select the attractive option when that option maximizes gain, at least on the x-axis, and ignores the reward. Okay, so by contrast, if we increase the reward of our option, it should be more attractive. We can then define something like impulsivity as the inconsistent choice is picking the thing that's less attractive because it minimizes the cost associated with the y-axis, regardless of the reward structure. Now, we can do this, we can fit these models that are hyperbolic discounting models to kind of figure out what the space of this R and T looks like. And then we can define an experiment by picking combinations of points of R and T that give us some probability. So if I slice through this manifold, I know that any combination of R and T on this line, this subject would be indifferent toward. Okay, and so I can define my levels of the experiment as something like that, and this is actually what we're going to do in the experiment later. So the experiment is something like this. The procedure is first thing we bring in the subject, and we get a sense of their choice manifolds. We have to have a sense of what that thing looks like so that we can interpret consistent choices from inconsistent ones. And we use a simple staircasing approach to do that. So once they're done, we estimate this manifold, and we generate all the trials that will compose that experiment for that observer. Then we put them in the scanner and collect some data. Now, as a first pass, we did a really simple GLM to ask, what voxels in the brain are significantly correlate with our definition of self-control. What we found here are the usual suspects in this domain, which are all listed here. We then use an orthogonal contrast, to perform the exact same analysis, but for impulsivity, which is sort of considered to be the antithesis of self-control. So here, hardly anything shows up as being significant, except for maybe the DMFC. And we can test this with a full contrast analysis showing that these areas, yes, are indeed preferentially active during self-controlled trials. And so what this says is whatever's going on in the brain is doing something very different on self-control trials than impulsive ones. And this shouldn't be that surprising. We shouldn't expect the brain to be symmetric about levels of the independent variable. And so the issue for someone like me who's trying to link brain to behavior is that, when you look at the behavioral data, you don't get that asymmetry, okay? And so the critical trials or the critical blocks to focus on here are those two distributions. So just to walk through this, in the PLL equals 0.1 condition, you're not very likely to pick larger layers. Should be picking shorter sooner. Indeed, that's actually what most people do. But sometimes they make these they're like errors, right? They're inconsistent responses. And so whenever you look at that distribution and you place it in the context of the flip, the inverse of that, PLL equals 0.9, you start to see that these are very symmetric. And so we tested this, we did null hypothesis testing, fit all kinds of accumulator models to this, and we just never found any evidence to suggest that the behavioral data were asymmetric. Okay, so this presents a problem. How do you have a neural asymmetry without an asymmetry in the behavioral data? So what we did here was we developed a model that's based off of Townsend and Busmeyer's decision field theory. It's also related to Usher-McClellan's leaking competing accumulator model. So the model just assumes a mapping process from the feature level. So if I give you some inputs like $10 now or $R in T days, it's just propagating that information through a stochastic accumulation process, and eventually you make a response based on what the choice is. Okay. So this is just an illustration. The model is representing two alternatives. One is the SS and one's the LL choice, as accumulators shown in red and blue lines respectively. Now, as you're considering these two options, you're deliberating, you're accumulating this information, and at some point, a bifurcation point occurs, something kicks on, let's say a neural covariate, and you get this active suppression of tempting yet impulsive options. So this is what maybe facilitates a self-control decision. And we can get a sense of what that particular inhibitory process looks like on every single trial, and we can relate that to brain data. And so this is what we found significantly correlates with that inhibition process. And it's the green area there, and it's sort of overlapping with the self-control areas that we identified earlier on. So we get this nice neural asymmetry, but the nice thing is we also don't compromise the behavioral asymmetry. So we also get symmetric looking patterns in the behavioral data. So by linking the model sort of to neural data, we get this nice pattern of results that we couldn't otherwise get. Now, although the mechanistic model is important, our results are still limited in the sense they might miss out on important temporal dynamics of the decision process. So as we're relying on fMRI, we kind of lose that cool information of the stochastic accumulator model because it just doesn't have that resolution. Other approaches that, like EEG, they might give us some insight to this problem. So another line of work, we asked whether there's some way to use the description of the decision process, that is the cognitive model, to bridge or connect EEG, fMRI, and behavior. And the rationale is clear. If all of these measures, EEG, fMRI, and behavior, are just different measurements of the same underlying construct, in other words, the mind, then maybe we could just use the cognitive model to kind of guide our inference strategy across linking. And so that's what we did. We developed this three-way joint model, something that Scott Brown once referred to as a double jointed model. And so conceptually, this isn't a big stretch of the imagination from what I've shown you earlier. You develop these submodels for EEG and fMRI and behavior, and you just have one way of kind of fusing them together at this hyperstructure. Now, if you can fit a model like this to all of your data, then the inferences, at that hyper level, you're getting information about the temporal dynamics, you're getting information about spatial dynamics, and it's all contained in that linking function. Now, going back to the task, we already had fMRI data, so we just needed to collect some EEG data, and it looks something like this. So after a long period of data collection, we had subjects, who gave us both behavior and EEG, they gave us behavior and fMRI, and in a Bayesian setting, you can kind of treat these observations that we didn't collect from our experiment as just sort of missing. Now, to help the inference structure, if you want to say something about how patterns of EEG should correlate with patterns of fMRI for a given observer, you need to kind of fill in this gap, right? So we've got a couple more subjects to come back and give us behavior in EEG and then also behavior in fMRI a week later, something like that. Now, we can easily fit this model to data, but if we wanted to actually evaluate the utility of the model, we're going to have to put forward some kind of test. So one way is to simply hold out the data, right? So we're going to cross-validate here. We can fit the model to data. We're going to make predictions for that orange square, and we're not going to tell the model about the data in that orange square. And one other note is that I can fit this a variety of different ways. The model I've been hinting at, it considers all three measures together. But suppose you care nothing about EEG data, right? So you could develop a model that just looks at behavior and fMRI, or you don't care about fMRI data. So you can look at a model that just has behavior and EEG. And then finally, if you just have a model that only cares about behavior, that's the last step. And so you can use these four models, right, to kind of say, well, how much does fMRI actually help in terms of prediction? And also, like, what is the combination and so on. So when I fit the model to data, we again generate these predictive distributions over these effect parameters. This is for the cognitive model. I'm glossing over all the details of what this actually means, but as you can see here, the four models are predicting something different. So starting with the behavioral model, it's got the same mean, basically, but the variance is much wider, right? And so we're taking that variance to indicate that there's some form of constraint that the neural data are providing. And so you add EEG, you add fMRI, and you start to see that the constraint diminishes, right? And by the time you get to having all of them, you get a slight advantage here. Now, part of the reason why this advantage isn't super compelling is because of the way we had to kind of sieve the data to reduce the complexity of the problem. And we're working toward methods, that kind of are more full scale, whole brain, and all the temporal dynamics you can throw at it. Now, although I've shown that adding more neural data does help to constrain the model parameters, I haven't shown you that that's a good thing, right? It's possible that adding neural data is giving you constraint, but in the wrong directions, causing you to make wrong predictions. So we have to evaluate this again with cross-validation. So what I did here is I fit the model, held some data out, made some predictions, and I'm going to compare. And I did that again and again for all the subjects who gave us both EEG and fMRI. And I did that again for all four models. Now, at the start, I can just tell you that the behavioral model did really badly. It didn't correctly predict anyone's data relative to the other models, so I just kind of struck it from the analysis. So I'm only going to show you the three that ended up being toward the end. So this is a ternary plot. It's supposed to convey relative probabilities for each of the models. If each subject's represented as a node, and if that node falls in one of the vertices of this triangle, it's best supported by that model. Okay, so here, you see there's not like a super compelling win here, but keep in mind that these models already had neural covariance, so the bar is kind of high already. Okay, so now for something that's fresh and unpublished here. So many of the analyses I've shown so far proceeded in the usual scientific way, and that is you first develop a hypothesis, you go and you collect some data, and then you try to figure out where the link between brain and behavior is based on the experiment. But this is actually kind of inefficient, and it's really underpowered. So think of it, we have the hypothesis, and we tend to know what key regions are to some extent. That's why we're running the experiment. And we know what those computations should look like. That's how we develop models. So we kind of already know that, at least from my perspective, we know what that looks like before we even go to collect data. So the question asked in this line of research is whether or not we can somehow design our cognitive neuroscience experiments on the fly. And specifically, whether or not we could design these experiments to enhance our understanding of that link between brain and behavior. Can we develop an algorithm that will shuffle through all possible experimental designs and figure out what the best possible design was to infer the link? And you can see where I'm probably going with this is you could also extend this, right, to add also the question of what's the right experiment to optimize with respect to. And plenty of other people have considered this approach. They've done it from a behavioral perspective. You've probably heard of staircasing. I used that earlier today. And Bayesian optimization techniques, where you're sort of adjusting which stimulus you present on the basis of what you get from the data. Did they get it wrong or not? And you adjust accordingly. And people have also done this in fMRI, where basically you have a set of tasks, and if you're saying, I want to know which of these tasks most strongly activates a particular brain region, then you can do that optimization problem as well. But you haven't really fused them together. So, again, trying to get the best of all possible worlds, I teamed up with a very promising student of mine, Giwan Bak, and so we're trying to build an algorithm that will efficiently do this. So this shows a conceptual flowchart of the method we developed. In an fMRI experiment, neural data, they come in as a time series, and this gives us information about the bold response. However, for practical purposes, cognitive models will typically require trial-wise characterization of the data. And so the first step in this process is to acquire real-time fMRI data, process it, and preparing it for it to be linked to the brain. Now, at its core, a joint model conveys the link between the real-time data and the associated responses in the way that I've described earlier today. And so we're going to, again, use this set of parameters omega, which are conveying that link, so how the brain is ultimately guiding that response. Now, with a full joint model in place, we're now really well postured to just optimize the experimental design according to the informativeness of the parameters. So once data are collected, we can use this process called adaptive design optimization to search through all candidate experimental designs. So ADO is a Bayesian design optimization method, and it uses mutual information as its utility function shown here. So in this context, utility just means usefulness or informativeness of each possible experiment. Now, as the experiment progresses, ADO will continue to optimize the design to maximize information in that brain to behavior link. But it's always conditional on what it already knows. So given the first 10 trials, it'll propose potentially something very different on the 11th trial than it would have on the first or second trial. Now for the optimization procedure, it continues by always selecting the experimental design that's expected to reduce uncertainty of the model parameters. So I've shown this a couple of times. We're kind of looking at that constraint of the parameter, right? And so we're always trying to pick the design that minimizes the variance. All right, so the optimal design, just to close this loop, once you've figured out what the right thing is to present to somebody, you're going to present that stimulus and you kind of rinse and repeat. And you do this for however many trials you wish. You have some stopping criteria and you're trying to learn something, or maybe you just have 1 hour to scan this participant or something like that. Now, I'd like to show you just a proof of concepts of study. It's carried out to verify this idea of fMRI-based ADO. So I'll give you the exact same procedure for a simulated experiment and then later show you results from a real experiment. So the task we're using is just contrast discrimination. Participants presented with two graded stimuli consecutively with different contrast levels. And basically they're just deciding which of these two stimuli have the highest contrast, the first or the second. Now, what I'm going to show you is just an illustration of the ADO process on top of this joint model. So on the left here is a set of all candidate experimental designs where a contrast value on the first option is shown on the x-axis, the contrast of the second option is shown on the y-axis. So all of them are listed here, and it's a heat map, so the white here is supposed to reflect higher utility designs. And on the right, we have the posterior distribution, marginal distributions for each of the model parameters. Now, you want those to converge to the true parameter value that's generating the fake data, which is that red vertical line there. So as you can see, the algorithm starts with a sort of impoverished representation of the brain behavior link, but once enough stimuli have been presented, it starts to converge on the correct representation. So note that the algorithm does seem to have a sort of opinion about which stimuli it should be presenting, and this does seem to change with respect to time. Now, this is just one example, but if you do this across many combinations of ways of generating data and so on, you get something that looks like this. So as you can see, ADO has a clear opinion about which of these stimuli are producing the most information, and this information does seem to change through time. So in the first trials, we're going to focus here, but on the last block of trials, we're more diverse. So the question is, does this opinion that the algorithm seems to kind of figure out, does it lead to better results? So in general, the answer is, yes. Here are some plots of key performance metrics such as the root mean squared deviation and the posterior standard deviation as a function of time. So where ADO is shown here in red and the random sampling is shown in black. So there's a lot of variability in the performance metric, but the general result is that the worst ADO can do is still much better than the average performance of a random sampling. You can then ask questions such as, how many more randomized trials would I need to match the same amount of information that I got with ADO? So it's just one example of, if I run ADO for 20 trials, I would need to get another 12 trials of random sampling. So that's 32 trials for random sampling. So that's a factor of 1.6. And this is just a really simple experiment and a simple model. So you can imagine this scaling up to, many larger design spaces and so on. So I think these are promising results, but it would be really cool to show this works in real data, where the sources of variability are far more unconstrained. So I'm going to show you the results of just 3 subjects, 3 sessions, each of whom are participating in this experiment. And so we're assessing subject-to-subject variability as well as session-to-session variability. And we're using a localizer task just to identify V1, and that's the optimization that we're performing with respect to. Now, in the simulation study, you can always rely on the true parameter values that generated the data, but in the real world, you never actually, know the truth. So you have to figure out a way to kind of say what the right answer is if you're going to evaluate the performance of the model. So what we did here is just kind of pool the information. So each subject, they gave us an ADO run, where ADO was generating the stimuli, and a random run where we were sampling it at random, and we're kind of pooling that information to serve as the benchmark. So we're always kind of comparing to that. The idea is, the more data you have, the better you have the opportunity to inform that brain behavior link. So here are some example posteriors just from fitting the joint model to either random or ADO conditions. ADO here is shown in red, random is shown in blue, and this is sort of an ideal result. So what you should expect is that the constraint is as high as possible, so the variance is really small across all of these pairwise distributions, and it should sit somewhere in the same space as the randomized design posterior. So this seemed to work for a couple of our examples, but here's an example of one where it's a little bit ambiguous. So you can kind of see that the constraint is generally there, but the degree of overlap's a little different. Okay, and so this can be driven by things like head movement. We're not really sure. We've looked at all kinds of reasons, and it just seemed like every once in a while this happens. So another way of assessing the algorithm's performance is not just by constraint, but by comparing the predictions of the model when either fitted to ADO or random design. So again, the benchmark here is this orange line, The ADO is shown as the red line, and random is shown as black. And so this is just one example of what we learn about how the brain is responding to the contrast levels of the design. Now we can imagine just taking the difference between these curves and doing this across all time points and all sessions, and you get this kind of aggregated result. So an ADO win is whenever it's above 0, and you can see that across the board we do get that, but the strength of the degree to which we got that, it varies clearly across sessions. Okay, so just to wrap up here, if we truly believe that neural and behavioral data provide meaningful information about the mind's computation, then developing ways of integrating the two fields would be a useful endeavor. But we can't hope to directly connect these variables if the purpose of our inquiry is the mind's computations. So to do this, we must either develop a theory of the mind, or we have to posit latent variables to quantify the degree which a linking hypothesis is evident. So until we have a grand theory of the brain that we can all agree upon, joint modeling is just one convenient way to evaluate how the brain produces behavior and build toward that goal. So there are lots of people that have contributed to this line of work. Here are 6 of them. That's about all I could fit on this slide without squishing faces too much. And as well as several really smart people that are back in my lab in Ohio. So thanks.